首席经济学家洪灏先生和美国经济学家灰犀牛作者 Michelle Walker 女士在凤凰云业化共同对话。那么首先呢，简单介绍一下二位经济学的教授。那么沃克女士呢是风险应对方面的专家，我们所熟悉的灰犀牛的概念就是由她提出的。那么她也曾担任纽约国际政策研究所所长，那么也长期为纽约时报、华盛顿邮报等国际媒体呢撰写文章。那么2017年灰犀牛中文版在中国面世以后呢，就让灰犀牛成为了中国媒体上的热词。那么这个概念呢，是提示我们要注意那些大概率并且会持续的发生影响的潜在的危机。那么我们今天也会请沃克尔来聊一聊，我们现在会面临哪些灰犀牛，哪些灰犀牛正在全球的金融市场上蠢蠢欲动。那么洪灏先生呢，也是全球市场的交易者和活跃的观察者，那么为投资者提供了非常多有价值的市场观点。那么今天两位嘉宾呢，分别来自东方和西方，但是又同时具有着全球视野的经济学者。那么我们非常期待二位共同对话能够碰撞出哪些不一样的火花。
Well, first of all, I want to express my gratitude towards having the honor to have a dialogue with Miss Michelle Walker, whose book I have read like so many years ago. Actually, when it first come out, I actually read it. Right, so I think it was like maybe 6 years ago.
6 years ago, but 2017.
Yeah, six years ago in China. Yeah, it was a great read. And then because nowadays the world we're living in full of great rhinos. And I think the proposition or the first proposition of such risk with high probability and then huge impact is very impactful in today's economy, especially in China. So I think nowadays, as you can see, China has moved towards a stage where it's becoming more inward focused, right? So as opposed to the last 20 years where China is more externally focused. China is more focused on exporting Chinese-made goods to overseas to satiate overseas demand. But I think over the past 3 years, because of the COVID-19 situation and also because of the reshifting of the leadership's focus towards the domestic economy, China is quite different from what we know 20 years ago. And at this stage, there are like so many gray rhinos here in China. And that is the reason why I found this book, The Gray Rhino, particularly more applicable to today's environment. For example, the local government debt situation, right? So it's been dragging the economic performance of China, because the local government has borrowed so much, and therefore, for some reason, today they can't repay their bills on time anymore. And then at the same time, because of the reshuffling of the global supply chain, many of the Chinese exporting business find it harder, to export their goods to satiate foreign demand like it used to. So, in today's environment, what the financial market is, trying to price in all this volatility really is that, if you look at the Chinese asset price, right, it's just going all over the place. Even the most resilient asset class, namely the Chinese equity, that has been going up. The prices of the Chinese property has been going up for so long, for more than a decade, and now seems to be hitting a pause and actually gradually rewinding as well. Right, so this is a huge gray rhino for the Chinese economy. I think everybody now in the economist circle recognize this. Meaning if the Chinese property price goes down substantially, right, so it would hurt the bank's balance sheet and therefore hurts the bank's lending ability, and therefore the Chinese economy could go backward. If all these things are happening. So, I think, as a result, even though recently there have been lots of macro policies coming out to support the Chinese economic growth, the market is not responding, which is quite unusual, right? Because if you invest in China, you know that it's a policy driven market. But for some reason, this time around, even though we are issuing lots and lots of economic policies trying to support the economy, it's not responding. Right? So I guess this is the sort of a challenge that people who like me investing in the Chinese economy and also the Chinese market are facing. The gray rhino is coming towards us. And, to me, as a market participant, we find it very difficult to avoid this trajectory, right? So we're seeing this rhino coming right towards us. But it seems to me that, there isn't that many ways that we can avoid it, right? So if we have a chance, I would like to ask Michelle, whether, she could come up with a way or some suggestion that, we can avoid, being hit by this gray rhino and continue to grow, further on in the future.
Yeah, well, it's a really important situation, and I think some economic history is useful to create some context and to think about what's going on. And of course, real estate has been an issue for some time. When I would go to China, people would say, "Oh, my parents want to buy this apartment in Beijing," and I tell them, "Oh, look how high the price is," and they say, "Oh, it's okay, nothing can possibly go wrong." And people I know were really just pulling out their hair because they were worried about their parents putting money into a market that everybody knew was very hot and very speculative. And so, of course, senior Chinese officials have talked about gray rhino, about real estate as a gray rhino before prices started coming down, and looking at the danger of overheated debt, of too much debt, and a possible Minsky moment, at which point this would become completely unmanageable and outside of anybody's ability to control. And so, in the West, I think the media has gotten the story quite wrong. And I think that they missed that the cooling down of the property market in China was the result of a set of deliberate policy decisions to keep that Minsky moment from coming. And although it's a very, very difficult and bumpy ride right now, and it was a very difficult decision to make, I think that if those policy changes to try to let some of the air out of the bubble had not come when they did, eventually the problem would have been much more painful than it is right now. And we're seeing something somewhat parallel in the United States with the commercial real estate market. Where, American newspaper and magazine commentators have been talking about commercial real estate as a gray rhino, as prices have been falling. So I think that recent history is important context. But also, if you look through history at the economic cycles and monetary cycles and the business cycles, you do see this, up and down. And that's the way it goes. There have been a number of people who I respect who've been pointing out that after a time of high debt, high investment, rapid growth, it is inevitable that you're going to see a slowdown. And so the question is, when it occurs, by how much is it going to slow down? And is it a managed slowdown or is it a chaotic slowdown? Now, as we've seen with the Chinese property market, it's almost impossible to completely manage a slowdown. Market psychology tends to get people to act more extreme in either direction. So when they think prices are going to keep going up, they get more and more manic and keep riding it up. But at the same time, when things start going down, they overreact and things keep going down further. So that's the reality. I think it's obviously painful for many people. I think the challenge from the policy side is to look at how to cushion the people who are most vulnerable from being hurt, from putting more of a floor on, and to find areas where you might find unexpected benefits, such as areas where there's overbuilding and there are unoccupied spaces. You know, could some of the people who are suffering in the other areas be brought into some of those places? There's another issue that I don't think has gotten enough attention, which is the question of deflation and lowered prices, which of course has been, different from China and the rest of the world. And I think that offers an opportunity, because often if you have a debt workout and you write off a lot of debt, it has the potential to be inflationary. So the lower prices now give a little bit of policy space that there might not have been before. And as you know from the Grey Rhino, my previous work was with sovereign debt crisis, which is somewhat different from the local governments and the specific industries. But I have, for a long time, argued that when it's clear there are problems, the sooner you work out the debt, take a haircut if you need, and restructure things, the sooner you do that, the smaller the pain is going to be in the long run. So although it's not an easy thing to do, I think that the government made the right decision by deciding to try something that most policymakers would be afraid to do, which is to start taking some of the air out of the bubble before it becomes a completely unmanageable situation.
Yes. The U.S. government had a sovereign debt, not yet a crisis situation, right? So it's more or less, they borrow too much and soon they have to shut the government down, because they found it hard to pay the bills. The Chinese government had a different sort of challenge, in the sense that the local government relied on land sales proceeds to replenish the budget deficit. But then, these 2 years, because it's been so difficult for the Chinese property, therefore, they found it very difficult to sell land, and therefore, there's very little revenue intake, for local government, and therefore it gradually morphed into a crisis. This is a very typical example of a gray rhino that is coming our way. But I'm sure that, the Chinese government is trying very hard to sort of resolve the situation. But, before we go any further, Michelle, let me backtrack a little bit. I am very delighted to have this opportunity to have a conversation with you, because this is a book that I read for a couple of years, but then I don't think anyone claimed to really grasp the gray rhino concept deeply, right? So because there's another very famous book by Nassim Taleb, right? So it's called The Black Swan, right? So the Black Swan is an event that has a very small possibility of happening, but when it happens, it's a huge impact to the economy. And in a way, people in finance industry, tend to gravitate towards that kind of concept, because in the financial market price distribution, right? So for some reason, price tend to be factile and tend to be sort of left leaning, meaning that, a small negative event, happening, can have a very dramatic impact on your portfolio, right? So people in finance industry, tend to gravitate towards this concept, trying to buy enough insurance policy, against this sort of risk. But I mean, the problem, with this kind of approach is that, firstly, ignore a large probability event, right? So that could have huge impact on your portfolio, which is the gray rhino event. And also, because, even though, the financial market price distribution is very factile, but it only happens like every couple of years, right? So if you keep buying an insurance policy for like, I don't know, for 10 years, then eventually it will happen and pay you off. But then the insurance premium that you pay across the past 10 years, maybe, I don't know, it could be quite hefty, for you. to buy this insurance policy. So Michelle, as an author to this great book, I want to ask, like, how do you compare the concept of gray rhino with the concept of the black swan, and how, like, in real life, how do people apply the gray rhino concept, to manage a financial affair or maybe some other affairs?
Well, first, thank you so much for the kind words. I'm really honored to be in a conversation with someone as respected and thoughtful as you. So thank you for that. As far as the black swan versus gray rhino, I get a lot of questions about that. And in fact, a couple of years back, I was on a panel discussion with Nassim Taleb in Dubai, where we were talking about the possibility of another financial crisis, and the other panelist didn't think it was as likely as the two of us did. But it wasn't until that panel, that conversation, that I realized something that doesn't come out in the media, particularly in the West, where people say, "Oh, I'm going to be the one to see the next black swan," which, of course, by definition means it's not a black swan anymore. The minute you can picture it, it's not a black swan. When you picture it, when lots of people see it and talk about it coming, even though they might not know the exact details, it's a gray rhino. But what's really central to his work is that the world is a very uncertain place. And the past few years, we've come to understand that in a way that many people had forgotten or never understood in the first place. And that his point is you need to be flexible, you need to be flexible, to be where when businesses make a lot of profits, this house of cards, the paper economy. And eventually that is going to meet back up with the real economy that is being starved of some of the investment that it needs. And the investors who do believe that securities have some relation to the underlying asset, they're going to be hurt quite badly. So I think the black swan is incredibly useful for helping us to expand our imaginations, to imagine things we might not have otherwise imagined, to realize how uncertain and unpredictable the world can be. But it's not useful as a cop-out, as a backward-looking concept. And the gray rhino is forward-looking to help to prevent problems in the future, to help to minimize, to help avert the most damage.
是风险应对方面的专家。我们所熟悉的灰犀牛的
I think the black swan is incredibly useful for helping us to expand our imaginations, to imagine things we might not have otherwise imagined, to realize how uncertain and unpredictable the world could be. But it's not useful as a cop-out, as a backward-looking concept. And the gray rhino is forward-looking to help to prevent problems in the future, to help to minimize, to help avert the most damage. And the gray rhino can be useful in hindsight only if you are learning the lessons and applying them to the future, and if you're using it to hold accountable the CEOs who saw a big problem coming and didn't do what they should have to deal with it. So thank you for that question.
Yes, that's really great answer from the original author for this great book. Right. So I'm to follow on these questions, right? So in today's world, there are like so many gray rhinos. For example, if I look at the U.S., right? So the U.S. government had a debt ceiling situation. The debt ceiling has been increased, but ever since then, the federal government debt has increased by 1.6 trillion US dollars, which is a great deal. And for the Chinese part, just now we discussed some of the problems that we have. All right, so let's suppose an investor or company management, seeing a gray rhino coming his or her way, how best to manage this risk? Because with the black swan, you probably can buy portfolio insurance. You can do a lot of stuff. But with gray rhino, because a high probability event with huge impact for us as an investor, how do we sort of manage this kind of risk?
Well, here's where the gray rhino becomes useful is that it depends on the kind of investor. Are you the kind of investor who sees the big scary thing coming at you and does something about it or not? And the thing about gray rhinos is that many, many people are talking about them, and some of them are responding or talking about their response. A lot of the way that risk management tends to be portrayed in the Western media, at least, is we're going to identify the next risk, that it's all about identification. But not enough people pay attention to the fact that you need to think about your response. That effective risk management isn't just saying, oh, I'm the one who predicted it. It's here's what I predicted. Here's how we responded. And in the ideal situation, people respond so well, whether it's businesses, citizens, governments, that the gray rhino turns away. And, there isn't one. That's the most successful gray rhino management. But for businesses, there are a couple of principles. I think one is if you are managing a business or you're a board on a business, make sure that you are talking about the things that could go wrong, especially the chronic ones, which are the ones that you're more likely to look away from just because they're there. Make sure that you have a structured debate with different kinds of input from different perspectives, from different stakeholders. They're going to see the gray rhino differently. So that's number one, most important, that you identify it, talk about it, go into detail about what it really means in terms of everyday operations and how you can respond. Number two, remember that humans are so vulnerable to not dealing with gray rhinos that you can look at the opportunities. What about your competitors who are not dealing with it? You certainly don't want your competitor to be the one that recognizes the gray rhino and has a good response. So think about the competitive part and the comparative advantage that you have. And the third is when you're talking about costs, make sure that you're not just talking about the cost, the energy, the staff time, the whatever, the investments to minimize the problem. Talk about the avoided costs. What are the costs if you don't do something about it? And we're seeing a lot of that. Like I was just rethinking the Sony hack of 2014, which followed another hack a couple years earlier, where in each one of them, they lost nearly $200 million. So that's $400 million in all. But much earlier in 2005, a senior official says, well, I'm not going to spend $10 million in order to avoid losing $1 million. So, $10 million to avoid losing $400 million is pretty good math, if you ask me. So I think it's those things that the identify, talk about it, make sure that you're really open and thorough about it. 2, look at the competitive landscape and what it means for you against your competitors. And 3rd, account for avoided costs. And this is true also for the portfolio investors and traders in the market. What are the gray rhinos that are not getting the response that they need? What are policymakers or businesses or your competitors doing to respond to that? And that will help you to frame your own response and come out ahead.
Yes, certainly. Now, I mean, in today's world, Michelle, in your opinion, what are, some of the potential gray rhinos that is coming our way? And if so, how best, and would you make some suggestions as to how best we manage those risks?
Well, as many people know, for quite some time, from the global macro perspective, which is where I'm coming from, there have been 3 big interlocking gray rhinos, which is the climate change, financial instability, financial fragilities of many kinds, and inequality. And I would add right now to that geopolitical instability and tensions. And diving down into the financial fragility, since you've mentioned U.S. debt a couple of times, I want to dive into that. So Fitch, one of the 3 major U.S. rating agencies, in August downgraded the U.S. credit rating. So no longer the top of the heap, no longer the gold standard. And they mentioned 2 different problems, which didn't have so much to do with the actual absolute level of the debt, but one, the deteriorating fiscal outlook of the United States, which, they didn't mention specifically, but has a lot to do with debt and the inability of the government to deal with it. And the other problem that they mentioned as part of their rationale was the governance problem. Now, the U.S. should not, in any situation, involuntarily not be able to pay its debt. I mean, I think everybody can agree on that. And that's why every time this debt ceiling debate has come up in the past, everybody has assumed that it will be solved. So it's nothing to worry about. And 2011, the last really big possibility that there might have been a default, the markets really kind of brushed it off. The stock markets didn't, but the bond markets did. And this time, the bond markets were taking it a little more seriously. And that's because we had the Treasury Secretary coming out and rightly sounding the warning, saying that, if we don't have an agreement by this day, then we are going to default. And the government was seriously looking at other maneuvers that it could do to avoid defaulting. And the reason for the potential default was political dysfunction, was that it used to be in the United States where the 2 parties could disagree, but they could talk to each other. They could eventually come to a solution, and they didn't come up with, personal insults. That wasn't how politics was done. Today, so many Americans are worried that this is not the country that we recognize. And every government shutdown, including the one that is looming right now, have to do with political dysfunction, with self-inflicted wounds, or own goals, as we might say in soccer, or football, as Americans don't say. So I think that's very concerning, and I think it's also an example of the systemic nature of gray rhinos. Just as you were talking about how the real estate situation in China plays into local government finances, and perhaps a bigger question of, is this the way to finance governments? Because at some point, land is going to run out anyway. So there's another gray rhino down the road. But in the United States, we need to be looking, and many people here are, I have to say, many people are quite concerned. They want to see America return to the country we thought we lived in, which is where people could have constructive debates about the right thing to do and could come up with solutions that didn't make everybody perfectly happy, but that, made fewer people angry than any other situation would have. So that's really my biggest concern right now, is this U.S. political dysfunction that leads to financial fragilities, and also it leads to geopolitical tensions, because as I've written about for years and years, even before the gray rhino, is that when you have a political instability or fragility, the oldest and tiredest trick in the political book is to blame it on immigrants or foreigners, or to otherwise try to deflect people's attention outside of the things that are going on wrong at home and the things that we completely have the power to fix. And I think that's where we really need to focus on getting our own house in order.
Yeah. Now, with the gray rhinos, right? So they're like little rhinos along the way as well, right?
My friends send me videos of little baby rhinos. They are so cute.
That's right. That's right. So, let's use the U.S. situation as an example, right? So the government is having, the federal government is having problem, with its borrowing. And then, obviously, the debt limit has to be increased. Maybe the Fed has to print more money, to buy up all this government debt, because in the months of July, the Chinese government cut substantially its holding of the U.S. Treasury. And I'm pretty sure that, many other sovereign governments are doing more or less the same, because the inflation situation in the U.S. is still quite severe, right? Very, and as a result, if you're holding onto the U.S. Treasury with, fixed interest rate, you could lose out, if inflation gets out of control. So I think as a result, because of the sovereign debt situation in the U.S., the derivative rhinos from such a situation is that, the little rhinos will come our way, for example, inflation, unemployment, and also, because of just now you mentioned the income inequality and wealth disparity, and therefore, the social instability comes with that inevitably. So, in this case, all right, so besides dealing with the big gray rhino, that is really the huge elephant in the room, we also have to deal with the little ones, the cute ones. So, how best to approach this situation, because there are so many things that could hit you from different angles. So how best to manage such a situation, Michelle?
Yeah, well, I love the little rhinos analogy, especially because of the cute videos. But just to clarify, sometimes people will make a comparison between gray rhino and elephant in the room, and of course the big difference is that the gray rhino is moving, and people are talking about it. And the elephant in the room is the thing that stands there, and by definition, nobody talks about it. So now that we're talking about it, it's not an elephant in the room anymore, or a swan. But I do think that looking at things in a systemic way is so important. It's something actually that culturally, I think people in China and in Asia are much better at doing than in the West. People like to look at things in silos, in very linear ways. And if you talk about a system, they say, oh, you're all over the place. And so it's very, very interesting cultural difference that I have seen. In the United States, I think the underlying problem really is, as I mentioned, this dysfunctional government situation. We have a minority government in that, and this gets very complicated and I'll oversimplify it, but that basically the way that the voting districts are drawn, the number of people elected in Congress and also the number of Supreme Court justices who have appointed have been put in office by a much smaller percentage of the population. And so we have a non-representative government. And in many cases, we'll see polls where, 70% of Americans are in favor of a certain outcome, but the government's not doing something about it because it's not the majority of Americans who are represented in Congress. And so we really need to deal with that. Also, politics have become much more polarized. People have become much farther apart. In some surveys, Democrats and Republicans see the other party as a major threat to the country, which is quite frightening. Now, I've been in touch with a lot of people who've talked about different ways of structuring the political system to increase the interest on the moderates, the constructive people who want to bring the country back together. It's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I do think that any country to be successful has to focus on shared values and shared goals. And I don't see that that's the case right now. And many Americans, a constructive majority, also sees that. So it's a question of getting, really changing the system from a minority government to one that is much more responsive to its needs. I think in general, Americans think that the U.S. government is more responsive than it really is, and I think that they don't give the Chinese government enough credit for the response that it gives. So it's there's a lot of misunderstandings on that side, and I think that we're going to have a very hard time fixing the debt situation or anything else without fixing the political situation. And just one final comment on the debt. We're at a little over 100% of GDP right now, the government debt. And, in the 80s, you saw Japan coming off of a time of high borrowing, high growth. And there are times where Japan had over 200% of GDP. And so that is closely related to where interest rates are. And part of our problem right now is that with inflation, the Fed is increasing interest rates to try to get inflation down. But at the same time, that is also increasing the government debt because the government's paying more interest. And when you have high government debt and, too loose fiscal policy, that also adds to inflation. So you've got this sort of chicken and the egg situation, and a lot of debate over where to go with it.
Yeah. Michelle, just now you mentioned a very key concept that, I think many of the people outside of the US probably don't understand properly, which is that, the government is not representative, but then at the same time, whenever we look at the poll, the Gallup poll, for example, people don't want the US government to take on more debt. So they want to get the inflation situation under control. They probably want less immigration. I don't know. Right. But then, what the government is doing, the federal government is doing versus what the polls are showing is like such huge dramatic disparity between the two. Right. So you always make people like me puzzled. Anyway, next year is going to be an election year. It's going to be an election year. Right. So do you think, right. So obviously now, the Democrat, I don't know the, US politics well enough, but, from a distance, it seems to me that, the Democrat only have Joe Biden as a sort of a very viable candidate, a suitable contestant, to the US presidency. But then at the same time, Donald Trump, despite all the legal trouble that he has, he seems to have getting a lot of endorsement, from the Republicans. So would you say that, because the ideas the two parties have, regarding how best to govern America seems to be quite far apart. So, I would like to ask, your opinion, whether Donald Trump is a great rhino that is coming our way, because last time when he was in the office, he has wreaked enough damages. So, if next year he's got elected again, whether he could, do even more damage, to the system and also to the global community as well.
Yeah, so I actually wrote in summer of 2016, when everybody was saying there's no possible way he could win. I remember writing.
That's right.
Donald Trump is a gray rhino. Right. But also it's not just him. It's the people who support him. It's the broader disconnect in American society. And I think that also with Donald Trump, I think that the public endorsements are one thing, and what people say behind closed doors is something very different. Some reporters are revealing. And there was another poll I saw that said as many as I think it's 25% of Republicans thought that the legal problems, including the criminal indictments, gave them pause. And so in terms of people turning out to an election, it might be that people say one thing publicly, but people don't turn out to the polls. But nobody's willing to rule out Donald Trump because so many people did it last time. And I think with Joe Biden, it's been interesting to see that some of his results don't always match up with the polls. I think the Democrats have often had a messaging challenge. And I think the problem with both of them is that all Americans would really like to see a new generation of leaders, not just in the presidency, but in Congress. And so that's another dynamic there. So I think it's way too soon to say anything about the election because things can change so fast. People are worried about medicines on both sides. So it's going to be a very interesting time. And I mean, I've always been independent, but I am not a fan of Donald Trump. I don't think I've made any of that. And in fact, you were talking about the debt. I think a big part of the problem was in 2017, when he cut taxes for the very richest people. And actually, I remember the Wall Street Journal ran an article quoting unnamed senior sources in Beijing, saying that the new U.S. tax package was a gray rhino for China and, for the U.S. as well. When we talk about inequality, we see that the wealthiest are paying much smaller shares of their income than the rest of the country. We have a lot of people worried about whether Medicare and Medicaid, the sort of public healthcare services, are going to be cut or not. But it's actually not the very top people who are paying for that. It's a payroll tax up to, I forget what the latest number is, but very low six figures. So the wealthiest and even the upper middle class in the country are not paying nearly as much of their income into that as the regular middle class and the lower middle class. So there's a challenge there. And Warren Buffett has many times said that, as one of the world's most famous and most successful investors, he pays a much smaller part of his income in taxes than his secretary. And that's a problem. But at the same time, you see some interviews with people who are not the ultra wealthy, but they say, oh, well, I don't want to increase the taxes on the millionaires and billionaires because just in case I get really rich, I don't want to be taxed that much. And they don't understand that, because you're being taxed that much more right now, that decreases the chances of you ever becoming a millionaire or a billionaire.
Yes, that's correct. But I think, we can all learn from the Northern Europeans. They pay 90% of their income as tax to contribute to the
very, very highest.
Yeah, very, very, very high, very high.
But just the very highest income. Everybody else is much better off. But I think often the Scandinavian taxes paid are often overstated for political reasons. Often in the United States.
Right.
But I would I think it's about getting what you pay for. And if I felt I was getting good health care and had a somewhat equal society, not completely equal, because obviously there's a benefit to having additional incentives for doing more. But, if I had the kind of society that I hear a lot about in Scandinavia, I wouldn't mind paying those taxes. I mean, it's not perfect by any means, and they've got other issues. And when I've been there, it's been quite expensive by American standards. But
yes,
if you're getting good services, and if it improves your quality of life and the quality of life of the people around you, then a reasonable amount of taxes is not a bad thing. I don't like this extremely polarized, no taxes, lower taxes no matter what, or more government no matter what. That misses the problem. And of course, I come from a policy background where my question is, what works the best? And there are ideas from both sides of that aisle that are useful. I think a fiscally sustainable government is important, and that includes everybody paying their fair share of taxes, which is not right now.
That's right.
Less government bureaucracy, that, yay, I would love that. So I think that getting back to this idea of what's the best from either side, or what's the least worst from either side, and how can we work together when we don't always agree. And to be honest, you can apply that principle to so many relationships in the world.
That's right. Now, thanks, Michelle, for your very honest answer. Just now we discussed so much about domestic affairs, right? So we discussed the U.S. sovereign debt problem. We discussed the Chinese property, local government debt, and all that, right? So those are domestic affairs, right? So when we talk about gray rhino, one of the huge gray rhino that is coming our way in the international arena is the U.S.-China relationship, right? So that is something that we have to talk about. If we are talking about such important concept of, gray rhino. Now, I remember there's another very famous book. I think it's called Clash of Civilizations. It's about how the second coming, the second, in place, the country who is second in place, gets so strong, and it will strong enough to challenge the number one country in the world, which is the US and in China. And to us, many of us in China read this book very, very carefully, because it has been quite right in a way, right? So it actually foresaw the sort of a conflict situation that we're in right now, right? So between the US and China, obviously, the two countries are trying to work together, to find the best way. But one way or the other, what we're reading from this book, Clash of Civilizations, is that, the second is going to charge the number one, right? It's inevitable. And to me, it's a huge gray rhino, right? So in your opinion, right? So how best for China and the US to work together, to avoid, this gray rhino that is coming our way? And, if we can't avoid it, what could be some of the potential outcomes, out of these great conflicts?
It's such an important question. And I think it's so important to be able to speak openly about it. And I don't think that the clash is inevitable. In fact, there's quite a big debate in the policy circles in the United States about that right now. I've been asked several times to talk about, China as a gray rhino to the US. And I'd say, no, no. That's a very one-sided description of the situation. US-China relations, I think, absolutely, the deterioration is very much a gray rhino, not just to US and China, but to the whole world. There are things that we need to be working together on right now, climate above everything else, that we just can't afford to be at odds on. Talking about inflation, a fair amount of inflation comes from the new tariffs new-ish, they've been there for a couple of years now, but the tariffs placed on Chinese goods. One estimate I saw is that Americans are paying $740 or more a year extra because of that. And I think a lot of them don't even understand that it's something that that citizens are paying for. I think there are a lot of misconceptions in the US about China. and probably vice versa. I think that, in the U.S., as I mentioned before, there's what most American people think, and there's what the people in charge think and do, which is very, very different. I do think focusing on what we can cooperate on is very, very important. I think that there are a number of people in policy circles, including myself, who are trying to push back against this idea of a conflict being inevitable. And this also goes to a little bit to the black swan versus gray rhino thinking that I mentioned before. But I think in policy circles, one of the ways people show that they're smart in the US is to talk about all the obstacles to solving whatever problem, whether it's, bureaucratic culture or this or that. And they don't spend enough time on what we can do to fix it. I think that often the US overreacts to certain things, to their buttons being pushed, as we say here. I don't know if you have that expression in China. And obviously, obviously I'm not in China, so I can't judge as well the reaction there to, when the US tries to push China buttons, and tries to, we talk about it here a lot as chest thumping. So I also often wonder what's being said behind closed doors, and I hope that it is considerably more constructive than some of the political theater that we see publicly here in the United States. I don't think there's a simple solution, but I think some of it does include increased dialogue and connections between the people of both countries, between the businesses of both countries. And in fact, in the US, some of the parties who've spoken out saying we need to turn down the temperature on this are CEOs, and, focus on it's not great for US tech companies who've been told you can't export certain things. It's not good for a lot of countries. And this whole, we're going to de-risk now instead of decoupling, I don't even know what that is supposed to mean. But I think that there needs to be a lot of effort. And I think that every single person and organization in both countries who wants to see things improve should do everything they can. And that includes even, talking to the people around you. I mean, I talk to neighbors sometimes, and they will tell me with great certainty things about China that I know not to be true. And I have to find a way to, as gently and effectively as possible, try to change their minds. And so sometimes it's millions and millions of little interactions like that are needed alongside some of the top level interactions, whether that's business, diplomacy, government, working with partners, other countries at the same time. So I'm very, very concerned, but I don't think it's inevitable. In fact, coming from working with policy for so long, I feel like if I decided that all of the bad things that could happen were inevitable, I couldn't possibly even think about these things or do the work that I try to do. So I try to be forward looking and as constructive as possible, and encourage other people to do the same.
Yes, totally agree. I mean, as we're speaking, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi is speaking with Sullivan, right? So, there are some positive vibes, from this kind of dialogues coming out, and also, as you are, I also believe in, dialogues actually solve more problem, than many other ways. Right. So in terms of pushing the hot button, something very interesting happened recently. Right. So, as the Commerce Minister from the US was visiting Ramona. She was visiting China. Yeah. And Huawei come up with a brand new mobile phone that is 95% made in China, right? So, and then including this very advanced chip, that is, I think it's like 7 nanometers, which is a technology that was widely believed not possessed by China. But for some reason, this new Huawei phone has this very high-tech chip installed, in this phone. And everybody was stunned, really. And even me, I put in an order for the Huawei phone, because it's a different system, sometimes it's just good to have a backup. Right. So, but which, from the reaction from the US side, it seems to me like a hot button issue, for China and also for the US, in a sense that the US probably sense that the technology ban isn't working very well. And for China, it's like, we're showing off these very very advanced phones, to the world, during the visit of commerce secretary from the US, just trying to show off, what China is capable of. Right. So, in your view, so, such technology ban from the US, trying to sort of retard the Chinese progress, towards better technology, better whatever, whether it's going to be successful, and also, for China as a country in such a situation where, you're confronted, with so many technology bans from Europe and also from the US as well. Right. So how best, can China manage such a situation, tricky situation?
That is such a tough question, like what to do about it. Maybe I could go back to, like, I mentioned before that particularly when I started coming to China a lot, seeing the cultural differences, I also saw a lot of stereotypes. And in fact, 2017, right after The Grey Rhino came out, I was speaking at the MTA festival, and the CEO of Chira was there. And he said he had just come back from Silicon Valley and made this point that the stereotype in the United States is that China just copies everything. And he said it's changing now, where some of the US tech world is starting to copy things from China. And I think that exchanges of ideas and technologies is quite useful. Now, the argument that's made here in the US is, China could use these things for military purposes. And I don't know enough about technology or military equipment to be able to judge that statement. But I know that with a lot of the other situations and all the other stereotypes and misunderstandings that I hear about China, I question that. I think that U.S.-China relations maybe should go back to thinking about, okay, what are the biggest risks that the other country sees? And how could we do something that's in our interest that also reduces their risk perception? And I think some of that may involve, public joint statements by both countries, commitments to, various new international norms. And I think some of that might involve, say, nuclear nonproliferation. I'm seeing here in the US that people are wanting to put more money into military budgets, which I don't think is a good idea. I would rather see that going into, human capital and clean technology and things like that. And one of my biggest concerns with some of the geopolitical situations right now is that money is going to go into so many military technologies and things when it ought to be going into a war on climate change or so many other things. And I find that, the more money goes into education, and, not just one idea of education, but a real, broad-based education, the likelier people are to succeed, the more likely their economy is to succeed, and the less need there will be for chest thumping and military provocations. I don't think that there's much that anyone can do about that. There are certain people in the United States who believe that the center of the problem would be that the U.S. is no longer the global policeman, the hegemon, the number one. If the end goal is, being the indisputed number one or not, then I think we need more voices to speak out that the end goal should be a healthy planet where we don't have poverty, where we, minimize illness, where we those things.
Yes.
And because if you're not, if you want to be number one, what are you being number one for? What are you going to do with that? And frankly, it's a question any CEO, any leader of any organization or government should ask. So I do think that the way forward is to focus on common interests. And I think to reduce the worries on either side, on the military front and on the nuclear front. And I think it's an area where if China were to come out with a very forward-looking position on that, I think it would go a long way to not just easing some of the tensions, but I think also to reaching a new level of global leadership. And I think it would be a win-win for everyone. And I certainly would like to see the United States switching to a more global prosperity, shared prosperity type outlook, and to focusing more on some of the domestic issues where we can very easily make a difference by investing in education, in healthcare, in rebuilding our infrastructure. When I come back to the United States from China, I look at some of the aging bridges or the public transportation system, and it amazes me that Americans have a picture of our country that is not necessarily what the rest of the world sees. And I think we should be competing with ourselves. We should be competing with the best version of ourselves. And as I think every country in the world should be. And I think that you get geopolitical tensions when individual countries are going through tough times, as every single country is going to, because that's how the world works. Booms and busts, ups and downs. And
that's right.
Going through downs, we need to invest in ourselves, in getting ourselves to a place where we are not down and not blaming other people, other countries for being down.
Yeah, very well said, Michelle. And just now we discussed, so many huge topics. And I always wanted to have the opportunity to ask you, the author of such a great book. So now I'm handing back the mic to Nianxue, our host here, and see whether she has even more difficult questions for you to answer.
Okay. What you're just talking about is further more accurate with my outline. We're just talking about the Silicon Valley. So, Ms. Walker, do you have any suggestion for the Great Bay Area in China? Since this is a financial forum for the Great Bay Area 2023.
Well, I think again, the focusing on collaboration, I think on making sure that the world knows about some of the innovations coming out of there. I mean, it was a few years back, but I visited some of the very, very interesting startups in Shenzhen in biotechnology and other very innovative areas. And I think telling that story to the world is a very, very important part of the next phase of growth. And just want to, I have another call in about 3 minutes, so we should.
Okay, right. We should wrap it up.
I would love to keep talking. This is such a great conversation.
I know, Michelle.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I will ask last question for Mr. Hong Hao, and it's the gold price in China. 最近国内黄金的价格持续上涨，受到了很多人的关注。那么甚至于这个首饰金的价格也突破了600元每克。那么洪老师，您认为是什么样的因素点燃了中国消费者对于这个黄金的投资热情？而且很奇怪的一个问题是，现在中国国内的金价与国际的金价之间会有一个很大的差距。那么这些差距也引发了一些疑问啊，那您能不能解释为什么国内购买黄金的价格现在要远远高于国际的这个市场的价格？为什么会出现这样的一种现象？
我觉得这就是一个灰犀牛，就是说大家觉得就是在现在啊，我们要这个对冲一个高风险的尾部风险。那所以呢，如果我们没有其他的方法，比如说我们觉得这个风险非常高，那么我们买一个比如说黄金，那黄金呢其实它是对冲尾部风险的非常好的一个工具，对吧？那所以大家对黄金的需求非常高。那所以呢，如果我们看美元金价和人民币金价呢，那么它显示出来就是说人民币用人民币计价黄金呢，它其实显示呢，这个人民币贬值的这个趋势可能还没有完。但是呢，这个因为这个资本流动的管制哈，所以呢，国内和国际的这个资本市场呢，它并不能够进行套利的。所以呢，尽管国内的金价用人民币来计价呢，比这个国外的要贵哈，但并不意味着这个人民币它就像大家想的那样去贬值啊。所以呢，我觉得这个反而是呢是一个对冲风险的方法，就是我们刚才讲的这个灰犀牛，就是说我们怎么样去对冲这个灰犀牛这么大的一个风险。那黄金呢，很可能就是这么一个工具，那大家也认识到了。
其实我们更想问的是，为什么现在它虽然不意味着这个人民币的贬值啊，投资者为什么会持续的去对购买黄金会产生这样的一种热情呢？这背后有没有一些什么深层次的原因？
这就是就是我们中国人老是说乱世买黄金你知道吗？所以呢我相信呢，就是大家把这个格言呢付诸于实践。那刚才其实我们讲到，就灰犀牛就是一个概率很大，但是呢它冲击力很强的一个风险事件，对啊。那么大家现在认识到黄金的重要性，同时呢，对于黄金的这个需求增加了这么厉害呢，就是说大家认识到这是一个大概率的事件，而且呢它的冲击力非常大，所以呢这就是一个非常典型的灰犀牛。因为如果你要是对冲比如说这个黑天鹅的风险，对吧？那如果你要对冲黑天鹅风险，你会买一个 out of money put， 对吧？就是比如说标普现在4500，你买一个5000的这个 put， 甚至6000的 put， 对吧？那可能 cost you nothing。但是呢，当这个尾部风险爆发的时候呢，那么这个 put option 它就会 be in the money， 就是它就可以怎么说呢 in the money 哈，就可以帮你赚钱了。那所以呢，这个是完全两种不同的对冲风险的方法啊。那么我相信就是说大家现在认识到黄金的重要性，恰恰就是大家认识到了，就是说这个或者说潜意识，我相信很多人可能还没有机会看过这个灰犀牛这本书啊。但是呢，潜意识有大家认识到这个概率比较高，同时呢，如果这个事情发生的话，它对我们的冲击还是比较大的。
那所以您觉得现在还是一个好的时机，再继续在这样的一个高点去投资黄金吗？
我一直在这个说买黄金啊，所以呢，其实到了现在我还是说要买的，因为呢尽管美元强势那我们看到了黄金在1900左右，它徘徊了很久。就以前如果是出现这种情况，美元强势的话，那黄金肯定会跌的，因为黄金是以美元计价的。现在我们看到黄金和美元齐涨，那甚至呢，如果是这个灰犀牛风险爆发的时候，美元是不会涨的，一定是黄金在涨。所以呢，大家都看到就这样的一个形势啊。所以呢，我觉得这是一个大家管理自己这个投资组合风险的一个方法。
那么乱世买黄金还是您之前的这个建议？
对的。
那么最后一个问题是替我的一个同事问您的。他说他之前采访您的时候，你有一句话引起了非常广泛的关注，也是 说不要在推土机面前捡钢镚，也是警告大家防范的这个风险。那么对于现在我们最后来聊一点点 A 股的这个股市的点位，您觉得这句话还适用吗？如果换一个比喻的话，现在还会怎么来讲？
对，就是这句话其实这么说吧，这句话其实是一个非常有名的一句话。它如果大家看一下 Roger Lowenstein 他写的 When Genius Fell， 应该是01年写的，关于98年 LTCM 就是这个长期资本破产这个事件，对吧？那么里头最著名的一句话就是不要在推土机面前捡钢镚。什么意思呢？就是说LTCM 的整个这个投资的策略呢，就是赚这个价差。那这个价差它可能就是几毫几厘的这个差，但是呢因为它是很稳定的价差，所以呢你就可以加杠杆，对吧？然后呢把这个收益就放大了，很简单。但是这个问题在于呢，就是说我们假设在我们做这个交易的时候，我们假设呢就是说这个回报的它的这个分布啊的 distribution 它是跟历史是一样的。那刚才我们讲到就是说就黑天鹅事件就是说你觉得不会发生的事情它居然发生，而且这个事件对你冲击很大，这就是一个黑天鹅事件。所以呢他的意思呢就是说，如果你为了那几厘几毫钱在那拼命的捡，而且你捡得不亦乐乎，但是有一天咔嚓你的这个尾部风险爆发的时候呢，那么你以前所有的这些捡回来的这个几毫钱几厘钱积累着这财富呢就会消失。那这个一个典型的例子就是比如说圣诞节火鸡，对吧？感恩节火鸡。那感恩节火鸡呢，就感恩节的这个火鸡他在之前还是很开心的，他非常非常开心，但是到感恩节就咔嚓他就变成了盘中之物。所以这句话这个意思哈，所以呢非常推荐大家去看这本书 When Genius Fell， 就是当天才出错的时候。那么 LTCM 当年呢是囊括了很多这个美国诺贝尔奖经济学奖的这个获得者呀，option pricing formula Marin Schultz 这个著名的学者哈，他们都是在这个 LTCM 工作的作为 consultant， 但是最后也是出现了这么巨额的亏损，差点呢把这个全球的这个金融体系呢拖入到万丈深渊，因为它的 exposure 是当时是几万亿美元的这个 exposure， 那你想象一下，非常恐怖的。所以呢现在我们面临的环境是什么呢？就是我们在金融投资的时候我们要找的最重要的价格就是我们找出一个 mispriced 的这个资产，就是这个定价错误的资产。那么定价错误资产最根本的含义呢，就是说这个资产的回报它向上是有很大的空间的，但向下呢它的下行的空间有限，对吧？它类似于一个 call option， 就是一个看多期权的这个 payoff scheme。那这个时候呢，如果我们能够找到这么一个投资组合的话呢，那么我们的这个投资组合的回报就很棒了，对吧？往上是没有限制的，但往下呢下行的空间是有限的。那我们中国的市场现在说实话非常非常便宜。如果我说中国市场非常便宜，肯定没有人会说我不同意的哈。但是呢，就是说它缺乏一个 catalyst， 就是它缺乏一个向上的催化剂。那所以呢，在这个情景里头，我们并不能够说我们现在就是推土机里捡钢镚，因为说实话，钢镚都捡没了，韭菜都割干了。但是呢，就是我们这个现在的更像是一个，就向上是有空间的，但向下它其实是下行的空间是有保护的。所以呢，它这个推土机捡钢镚的这个策略呢，并不适用于我们这个策略，因为我们现在这个策略呢是一个它的 payoff 的 scheme 呢是不对称的啊，向上是比向下的空间呢更大的这么一个策略。
那么感谢洪浩先生和沃克女士刚刚的分享和深刻的这个见解啊。那么今天的对话为我们提供了非常多的思考，我们探讨了全球经济中的灰犀牛、通货膨胀和美国经济，以及关于金融投资风险防范等等的话题。那么我们也希望今天的对话呢对大家有所启发。我们刚刚也推荐了好几本书，包括灰犀牛、黑天鹅、当天才出错的时候，
还有那个 Clashes of Civilizations， 文明的冲突。
好的，好的，好，那么希望我们今天对话的内容能够为我们所有的投资者能够起到一个有益的投资决策的助力啊。那么谢谢大家收看今天的凤凰云夜话，我们就到这里，谢谢洪浩老师。